in providing us with most of the inventions which we still use today, like the telephone, the radio, the electric bulb, the projector that I'm using now. There were projectors in the 18th century, but they had to run on candles, and you wouldn't be able to see a thing like this. The motor car were all derived from that period. Steel, it is the use, characterized by the use of steel, by electricity, by chemistry. Business starts to combine in larger trusts and monopolies. It's the great railroad age in America. You get imperialism, looking for markets all over the world, the opening up of Africa. And one item which stands out a bit silly here, because it looks as if it's been, why is that here? Because that refers to a particular country. In 1870, Germany is unified. That has relevance to us because we are Germany's next door neighbors, and you will see on a map how that influences us. Because our next door neighbors unified, our trade started to pick up, and Holland became less an agrarian country and more a country of modern trade, and the cities started to grow, and we got our first industries. And so we got in Holland what you got here in the United States too, large 19th century slums. The fact that this second industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution was made possible by inventors, but the second industrial revolution was made possible by science. Scientists provided the manner of making steel, they provided the concepts for making electricity and for making chemicals. Now, this science was not lost on the artists and architects of that time. They admired that, and also they had one thing to contend with, which is that part of science had invaded their private domain, the world they lived for. Artists were used to be employed for depicting all kinds of things, and as photography got into its full swing, which it had, being invented in 1834 and being a fairly popular art, with everybody practicing it as it is today already in the 70s, well, art was crowded out of its personal preserve. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, they felt also that art should in some way try to become scientific too. The first efforts in that direction were Impressionism, and thereafter you got a very scientific movement which is called Neo-Impressionism by an artist called Seurat, and thereafter you got, from that, got not Culism but Cubism, which looks Russian, and Futurism, which had indeed to do very much with modern technology and modern science, which tried to emulate that. In between you had something else too, the movement to try to make an art which appealed not to the elite but to the broader masses. That has been an aim already before that, but it started to get really something of importance in the 70s, and from that you get part of that is Expressionism. Now, Expressionism derived, one of the fathers of Expressionism happens to be a Dutchman, of which everybody has heard because his pictures hang in all kinds of children's rooms. That's the man called Van Gogh. We'll show a slide of his. So he is connected to that. And architecture had, at the same time, was influenced by these scientific concepts of Darwin, of Libby, who made fertilizer possible, of the scientific revolution. And architecture was influenced in the sense that people tried to make it more rational and try to study construction for its own sake, and not as something that was just appended to it or something that was simply useful but subordinate sort of thing. The major names in that is the undoubtedly familiar Viollet-le-Duc, who wrote a wonderful book, which you must read, if possible in French, otherwise in English, called Entretien sur l'Architecture. I don't know what it's called in English. Do you know for one? Discourses on Architecture, it's called. 2 volumes of wonderful prose writing, as we can find them hardly today. There's an interesting architectural history put out by a man called Choisy. Choisy was a civil engineer, and he described architectural history as if it were purely and entirely influenced by construction, as if construction was the one and all of all architecture. Now you have, of course, also the well-known Americans, Sullivan and his one-time pupil, Wright, who also spent a great deal of time studying construction and producing buildings in which construction played a quite important part. That was also paralleled in Holland, and one of the first people I'll show is Mr. Kuipers, who did buildings in which he tried to apply the principles which had been evolved by Viollet-le-Duc and Choisy. 1914-18, the First World War. Holland is neutral. I won't step on all these categories. And there's only one important development. The architects got interested in housing, so the social question became something of importance to them. 1918, 1929. I divide a period between the two world wars in two for reasons of convenience. The first part, 1980 to 1929, are the boom years, the gay 20s, the stuff that Scott Fitzgerald wrote so beautifully about, and The Great Gatsby, which you may know from a film and perhaps some of you even from a book. That's the period in which Holland has its first industrial revolution. You get the companies which may even be known here. Shell is, because it advertises along the roadside. Unilever is half Dutch. And Philips, which is our Westinghouse. In art, you get a quite important development in the creation of the Bauhaus. Since the Bauhaus leaders came over after the takeover by Hitler, it's a well-known term in this country too. In fact, it influenced this country architecture quite a bit. There is something called constructivism, developed in Russia and developed further in Germany, and there is an art movement to abandon all art called Dada. That had all to do with the, particularly Dada, but the other ones too, with the sort of idea of a new start after the First World War. People were then still quite hopeful that the world could be improved. I still believe that, but I don't think that it's very easy to do. They believed it was more easier to do than they finally found out. And these are all idealistic movements of the first of the 20s. We contributed to that movement with our movement called the Stijl, and the most famous man, his designs are now used as table mats and as wallpapers, is a man called Mondrian. Both these developments, the Bauhaus and constructivism, tied on quite clearly to the developments in technology. There were a sort of belated turn of art towards the constructions and the world of technology. It was arising all around them in the machines, the transport industry, in the things that they could see all around. Think of the famous book by Corbusier, Vers une architecture, but his admiration for modern means of transport is quite clearly expressed. Expressionism and functionalism are, at that time, they stem from the past, but they continue into the years after the war, are important things in the development of art. Expressionism going trying to establish a sort of rapport, a sort of correspondence, talking to the art audience in a very direct way, not by very complex symbols, but by making a sort of outcry, establishing a sort of general art, and functionalism, on the other hand, trying to rationalize art. That's very definitely inspired by the technological and scientific universe as people saw it at that time. And that in 1928, there was founded an international movement called Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, or in English, the International Congress of Modern Architecture, but always known by its French epithet, its French abbreviated title, CIAM, and the Dutch participated in that too. That's why it's on that line. 1929, 1939, we get a depression, and the depression is something that overcame people. They felt it was a sort of calamity, and many people felt that why should that come over us? It's no fault of ours. It actually started in the most advanced country in the world, being the USA, and many people in Europe felt that it was imported from the USA, and it wasn't an import they wanted. This kind of thing therefore fostered also in the United States, but also in other countries, a great deal of nationalism, feeling that it's all caused by people outside, and this created the right-wing governments, of which Hitler's is the most famous, but Salazar in Portugal is also a quite well-known example, and of which a man like our Prime Minister of those days is also Colijn, is also a quite clear conservative government. Our depression lasted longer than most because we didn't get in Roosevelt and a New Deal, and so we stuck to our old guns, trying to preserve the gold standard for a long time. So we got the depression right to the war. Art movements. Surrealism came out of Dada on the one hand and was certainly influenced too by the bad times all around them. They went in for Freudian symbols. Freud became a fairly well-known man by that time, and they tried to depict the gloominess of the modern world sometimes. Modernism started to wane in all countries of Europe. It became less en vogue. People felt that modernism was very often attached to a sort of right-wing movement, to a sort of left-wing movement, and many people felt that that wasn't a viable way, that it should nowadays start to, we should return to the fathers, to the old country, to the nations to which we belonged, and perhaps to the good old past, the days of grandfather. That produced in many countries a reversal to historicism, also in my country, and to neoclassicism. We see a few examples of that. The Second World War, Holland was occupied, so it lost quite a few lives. The majority of its Jewish citizens, which were killed in concentration camps. We lost a great deal of our machinery, our equipment, our old plants, the factories, and a great deal of our housing. So we had to do an enormous amount of reconstruction, which we did partially, quite generously and effectively helped by the Marshall Plan. The years after 1945, 1973 are characterized, well, by me, maybe by other people in another sense, by the opposition of the two world powers. The US steadily climbs in power from this era to that. It becomes the one major power on the western side, and the USSR for some time the one major power on the other side. The Cold War, the decolonization, which influenced us too. We lost our Dutch East Indies, the Cold War, and of course Korea and Vietnam. We got quite a spate of art movements after that. Abstract Expressionism, hard edge, minimal, pop, or neo-Dada sometimes called, and conceptual art, which also carried over into my country. There is also a part of formalism which can be attached to hard edge, and a part of conceptual art which can be attached to the general world movement of conceptual art. This whole spate of different things may look as if they're sort of renaissance of art, but in fact quite a few of the concepts of these go back to these very fertile years. I would consider this, if there is ever a renaissance in the 20th century, I think that this is the era in which it happened, and this era is actually living on the capital formed by that stage. In architecture we get art architecture, of which this building is a fairly good example as far as I understand it. We get the new brutalism, the use of a lot of concrete, camp architecture, and touring and the like, and we get in my country Van der Broek and Bakema van Eyck and Tim. I will refer back to this scheme, which is over there sometimes, and we can now, let me see which one it is. That's it. No, sorry, I'll put the other one. Let me change this back, and I'll put this one in. There should be a slide on this side, the other projector, which shows the location of my country in the... I can't get it working. No, that's far too far. That's it. There we are. This is a short map of Europe, and you can see there it's marked in gray, and my pointer won't leave any mark on it because it's a white slide. You see there my country just underneath the arrow, and you see that how strongly it's attached to the German. To Germany, to Belgium, and it's all at the tip of the Rhine. So as a result, all trade is passing us by, and we are living a great deal. But we started our revival of our economy actually on the fact that Germany was unified in 1870, started to industrialize these large corporations. The Ruhr was industrialized at that time, and as a result, my country profited from this upswing in the German economy, and we got a little bit of the trade-offs of that too. And now the next slides on this side, yes. Here we see two examples of those scientific art movements on the one side. This on the left hand for you is Van Gogh, of course, trying to make an art which expresses something very directly. And there you have a not very good, but it's a wonderful painting, but not very useful, but the only one example I had, example of Cubist art, which tried to analyze the elements of painting into a sort of geometrical shapes. Now, these, and this analysis of pictorial space and this trying to make art a scientific procedure is influenced by the scientific setting of its time. We'll press both, and there you see they continue in the same lines. Let me see. Yes. Here you see a series of paintings of Mondrian, which are based on the Cubist manner of painting. You see they are actually completely different paintings, but here set in a row because it's the same subject. It's an apple tree, and you see how he transforms that apple tree from a more or less recognizable shape into something which consists only of circles and lines, and finally into a completely abstract pattern, which shows already in principle this division in verticals and horizontals for which he is known, and for which he tried to reach by this rather, to us it seems at least, devious route, but which was an effort to get at something general, just as science tries to get at something general. This is what was spawned by Van Gogh. This is a German expressionist paintings of the years 1921. I think a river view, and there you can see how this effort to get at people, to make an impact, to make an image which was really stand out, is quite clearly exemplified on that side. We'll meet both these strains in the architecture. And here, I think I must go, yes. Here on the right-hand side we see a later Mondrian, in which he has gotten finally to the shape which you think that he would hit upon immediately, which was actually a fairly long drawn-out process. Now, we go back from Mondrian in the 20s now to architecture, and here is a building, an eclectic building, the Rijksmuseum, our national museum. Some of you may have seen it because some of you, it seems, have been in Amsterdam. And this is what it was, quite new, a huge building, as you can see, in an eclectic style, but I'll point out points which are modern and which carry into the future. That is fairly visible on this side. This is a section through that building, and you can see in here that he constructed a large, these are two wings, it's actually a building made like a donut with interior courtyards, or two interior courtyards, and he showed, quite in the fashion that Viollet-le-Duc would have approved, he showed a vaulted hall. These halls were vaulted so that they could take art in an incombustible, fireproof interior, a vaulted hall, and the vaults were quite clearly shown in a medieval fashion. But he didn't show not only the vaults, he showed also, here in this interior courtyard, which was far too large to be covered by vault, he showed it by, he made steel roof trusses, and these steel roof trusses were quite clearly shown, as is evident from the next two slides. The construction is not all the decoration, but it's part of the decoration. Here we have an interior of that room I just showed you. This is that interior, and here you see that truss going up. It's all the way out. You've just on an edge of the slide, but I think that you'll appreciate the point. I'll see whether I have a few more now. And now we revert to another architect who can be seen as in the same kind of relation to this eclectic architect as people like Sullivan to people like Richardson and the generation that went before him. This is the exchange building by Berlage, and that's one of the buildings I want to stop over a little bit longer. I've taken on purpose not the usual view which shows that tower in front, that tower that is just underneath the arrow here. But the other end, the end which you see when you come out of the central station in Amsterdam, this is the plan of the building, and I want to point out that the plan is also quite rational. The program consisted of 3 exchanges, one for corn. People here in the front rows can even read them. One for corn, another one is a stock exchange, not the biggest one, over here, on this side, and a produce exchange. In between is here a shipping exchange where shippers get their cargoes, and in the middle of the building, and that's quite interesting to see, are the modern means of communication, the telephone office, the telegraph office, and on this side, the local telephone and the post office. Now, doing business in stockbrokering has grown to such volume, also in Amsterdam, that the telephone and the telegraph take the major share of it. And so this building has become obsolete by the very technology that the architect put in the first place. Over this, the entrance, here's the main entrance, because the central city is on that side. That tower, you're looking at this side, here, this lower side, and over the main entrance is the Chamber of Commerce, a very apposite place to put it in. The major point I want to draw your attention to is the one which connects this building with the previous one, and which connects it also with this technological stance of the rationalist architects of the 19th century, which is showing the construction in all details. You see here again a lot of vaulting, a lot of arches, and you see here trusses, and these trusses with these little triangular trusses connect them. There are vertical trusses at this point going across this hall, and then there are triangular trusses in between. These, a sawtooth roof, as we know it today, these things are all quite clearly shown. In fact, the architect, this is a cross-section of this exchange, and you can see that he might have put the roof truss, it's a double glazed roof, he might have put the roof truss in between the glazing, as around 30, 40 years ago, before him would undoubtedly have been done. But no, just as Kuipers, he showed them as plainly as possible, and he constructed this double roof simply by adding a vertical stension to the roof truss thing. Of course, these roof trusses were quite well known, but not in non-architectural buildings, being the great railroad stations. Here you see that, again, construction is shown as evidently as is possible at all. That it's more or less a handbook on construction, which I will show also by a few details. Here we have Berlage's drawing of how it would look like. It's actually nicer, I think, than the colored photograph. And you can see from his details how he loved actually all these constructional parts, the hinge of the great shape. He had to add finally tie cords because it would the very thin walls which you saw on the plan would not withstand the sideways thrust. Here you see that hall, which is actually in a sense more modern today, with these normal girders carrying across, this trussed girder carrying across, and these triangular roofs over it. That continues in details like this one. Here you see, for instance, a door, and you see that he made everything in exposed brickwork on the outside, not on the interiors, they are plastered, but that you could see every little detail, that you would see that these bricks are cut and how this is made, and how here even the wooden dowels in the doors are quite clearly shown. How they're not connected with nails or anything, no, even the dowels in the door have to be shown. Architects could learn the normal trade, or the old-fashioned hand trade of crafting, actually by going and looking at this building. Of course, this kind of trade has gone out of fashion too, but that Berlage couldn't know at his time. I will now show something of that this all derived from these 19th century buildings, and it's not only by these things are not so modern as they look, maybe. This is a drawing from the famous Dictionnaire raisonné d'architecture française, the French Dictionary of Architecture, in something like 16 or 20 volumes published by Viollet-le-Duc, dealing with all kinds of medieval buildings. And Berlage, although he didn't copy these details, used quite a few similarities. May I point out, for instance, the way that this corner statue is inserted as a part of the wall, and the way this little colonnette is put in the wall here. And you can see what are the sources of his inspiration. Here you see a window subdivided by brick colonnettes and by stone lintels, and it looks quite similar to this. It looks even more so if we get a more detailed view. Look at these windows over here, and you see how clearly they are similar. For instance, look at the tail end here and the tail end there, which is made so that you get a good joint at that point, to clear off the water. How he copied these medieval buildings, or looked at these medieval buildings rather, for inspiration for making this kind of thing. Now we can turn to a quite other architect who had similar attitudes towards construction, naturally, because you read the same books, but who had a completely different stance. He wasn't as rationalist, he wasn't as dry. On the contrary, he was more or less the source of our expressionist architecture. This is Kromhout, and he designed something very aptly called for his lecture the American Hotel, as you can see. American Hotel, Pension, Café, and Restaurant. And the lettering has gone, but you can see that it's this building over here, and you see that compared to Berlage, this building looks far richer. It is certainly not eclectic, it doesn't use much historical material, but it is bedecked in the eclectic manner with a great deal of very imaginative detail, a very rich kind of structure. It is from this building that the Expressionist architects of later on took their stance. And we'll now shift over to something else. What does this look like? Anybody know? Yes, Wright, exactly. This looks very much like Wright, but it is Holland. And this is, of course, very much influenced by Wright. In 1909, the German firm of Wasmuth published 2 volumes on, one volume in 1911, the second volume, on the work of Wright, which you all, and not only the work, but perhaps these publications you know also, or you know about at least. And these publications were quite influential. Berlage saw them, the architect of the Exchange, which I just showed before that rich building. Berlage saw them, and Berlage went over to the United States and looked up Wright and saw part of his buildings. The buildings around Chicago, and he liked him extremely. He wrote, which is extremely rare for architects, words full of praise. He lectured about him in my country, and he recommended Wright as an example to Dutch architects. And one of these architects took his advice to heart, and he studied these publications also intensively and came up with this, which looks like a little bit coarser version of Wright. And particularly if you look not only at the exterior with the roof overhangs, the horizontal windows, these whole rows of millions, you remember the Roby House, Unity Temple, etc. And you see also on this side how much he took even the coloring and the use of natural woodwork set against plaster from Wright. Berlage also took something from Wright, but because he was a more considerable artist, he didn't stick so close to the example. I'll show that to you too. Here are 2 buildings of Berlage's. This is his first Church of Christ Scientist in The Hague, and this is his of 1925, and this is his Gemeentemuseum or Municipal Museum, also in The Hague. And you can see, for instance, from this kind of detailing and these colored cornices, that there's very much a Wrightian flavor to it, but it is not so clearly a copy of the other one. Also, the same kind of Wrightian flavor is in this kind of pergola, or in these horizontal windows, or even in this plan, which is a fan-shaped plan with a tower in the middle. I'll shift back now to the Expressionist architecture, because that comes first. Oh no, I've still one more Wrightian example. This is very much Wright, and this is a building therefore perhaps so much liked by Americans, and not very much liked by Dutchmen. This is the famous town hall in Hilversum by the architect called Dudok. I don't know how Dudok we pronounce him, Dudok in English. And you can see that that's full of Wrightian detail, with these long strips of windows. Also fairly imaginatively done, these rather picturesque massing and grouping of things and these huge horizontal overhangs. I have now, I'll add a few slides on, I won't dwell with it too long, but I feel that I have to show them as a sort of part of our national heritage, a part which is still looked upon with favor by many people, which is our Expressionist school of architecture, and you can see, boy, that they really went places with bricks. They made all kinds of fancy stuff out of that. Look at these curves. These are just normal public housing. Well, public housing means something different in my country than it means in yours. It is not something looked down upon or really the bottom of the list. It's quite normal and general. We have huge amounts of it. But this kind of public housing, the architect really did a very fancy job. He used houses actually to create a sort of architectural townscape. I'll show one more slide of this. This is a department store in the same Wien, in The Hague again. These other ones were in Amsterdam, and you can see I won't dwell too much on that, on these pieces, because I think for the rest they're not. They don't point to the future, but that it's interesting architecture is quite visible. Now, the stance from right led to, and the attitude that architecture and art had to become more scientific, led to that development mentioned before, the so-called the style. And I'll shift to that now. On the right-hand side for you is a slide showing Mondrian when he still hadn't discovered, but he was, as you can see, on his way, this abstract pattern of lines, but he had discovered the abstract pattern all right. He made a series of shifting squares. That's Mondrian in 1919, making this kind of picture in various colors, but he's already trying to create things which are still more abstract and less picturesque by using only blues, reds, and a sort of yellowish, orangey yellow, and black and white. And he's changed that into pure red, blue, and white later on. That's all part of the same attitude to create a picture which was as abstract as science, and which would be as general as science, which would express a law of the universe. Now, Mondrian and his friends from Doesburg banded together with a group of people, with a few architects in it too, and as you can see from this picture over here, this is a disappeared pub in Rotterdam, but this building has a great deal in common with this kind of shifting squares, of making actually an architecture which looked like a painting, and which had the same kind of generality and the same kind of abstractness. There is the building which it looks most clearly in that sense. That's actually a picture more or less transformed into a building. That's the famous Schröder House, and I'll dwell a little bit longer on that. Van Doesburg, an artist, and the architect Van Eesteren at a certain time wrote up a series of points, and I'll read just a few. There are 16, but I'll read just a few of them to you, because they will express something of the stance, of the attitude which they wanted to express in architecture, and of which this building is an example. Point 7 reads, "The new architecture knows no passive moment. It has conquered the opening in the wall. The openness of the window has a dynamic meaning in relationship to the closeness of the wall surface. Plan. The new architecture has broken through the wall, and in so doing has completely eliminated the divorce of inside and outside. The style, aesthetic, how it works out in practice." The Schröder House. The lower floor of this house, shown over here, is quite traditional. The actual living room, or the main day room, you can say, is on the top floor, and that was because my country is quite flat, and to get a good view, you have to go to the top floor, so you can see over the underbrushes. Nowadays there's a road in front of it, but when it was built, it had a fine view from these top windows. This is a plan of that top floor, and you can see how he gets that penetration of outside and inside by the now well-known but then quite new means of carrying the wall just past the window and letting the window run up to that. That has been done very often since then by having plans continue from outside to inside, floor materials, etc. There are parts of this building undoubtedly which use the same kind of trick. By making roof overhangs. Actually the building is just normal rectangular, as you can see. It's a house built to an end wall of a series of old houses over here, which you can still see sticking up. But this house was simply a normal rectangle, but by projecting and recessing parts, you get this kind of effect that it isn't contained within a cube, that it seems to spread out and that you cannot define quite clearly, as the Barcelona pavilion did slightly later in Barcelona, a building with which I'm absolutely sure you're familiar. That building did the same kind of thing. The upper floor, that's this unity of space that Van Doesburg was talking about. You can see that's a completely unified space. It has a piano, a lot of cupboards, and a few couches in it, and a dining table over at this corner. Here, this is this large window in the corner. The plan is projected the same way as the building, more or less, well, the same. This is the front wall, and you can see that you had this view right from the dining table. Now, beside all these cupboards, you had moving partitions, and these partitions could move. Well, I made a mistake there. This is what a house looked like if you subdivided it. There you get these very immaterial wooden partitions, which made it possible to change it into a series of rooms without, of course, any acoustic insulation, but that wasn't considered very important because it was a very small nuclear family which slept in it. But that made it possible to change it from the one into the other. Rietveld tried to get all his things in very elementary shapes and to make these connections. Look, for instance, at this, the joints between the wooden pieces around the stair railing, by adding them, just as he did in his famous red-blue chair, just not putting them one through the other, but putting one on top of the other, so that they will be connected, and you would still see every separate part. Here are those elementary style colors, and you can see, this is the interior photograph not too long ago, that indeed he did get that kind of elementary coloring effect, and that the interior picture gives something of the atmosphere of the building. Now that's another building. We'll get that back. Here is a little corner, and to get really the kind of shapes that they wanted, they went to some length because they constructed even their radiators from bent pipe. They felt that the radiators were not elementary enough in shape. The radiators that were available for warm water heating were not elementary enough, and so they created their own shapes. Yes, this is something different, but that grows out of it. The style movement, or members of the style movement, were invited to participate in the famous Werkbund exhibition in the so-called Weissenhofsiedlung in Stuttgart, which is an international exhibition of modern houses in Stuttgart. It still exists in a somewhat damaged form. Here it is when it was quite new, and Germany was then covered with Biedermeier houses, all plastered like this one, but with pitched roofs, and this looked really quite startling. A whole quarter of these rather far-fetched, newfangled things. The architects who were invited by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the chief architect for this project, were, amongst others, Le Corbusier, Gropius, Taut, Charoun, and the Dutch, Oud and Mart Stam. And these architects, by getting together, discussed possibilities for founding some sort of international union, because they felt that the war was over and we should try to get a sort of unified, if not Europe, then at least a unified kind of architecture. They were also all in difficult circumstances because they were criticized at home, and as a result of this Werkbundsiedlung, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, SIAM, is that how you pronounce it? SIAM? How do you pronounce it here? SIAM was in 1928 founded in La Sarraz. Now, this Congress showed influences of society around it by being very much aware of the social problems of architecture. That sounds still quite modern. We can be proud that a Swiss and a Dutchman, Mart Stam, wrote the original charter written for that particular meeting, and which was signed by all the other members. Le Corbusier had a proposal too, but that was turned down, much to his dismay. And they showed their progressive and, let's say, slightly, at some of them even quite markedly leftist stance by interesting themselves in problems of everyday architecture and of the creation of the modern world, because they made congresses, the first in 1929 on the minimum dwelling, in 1930 on the parceling of land, on the neighborhood, and then on the even larger scale, the famous Athens Charter, the Charte d'Athènes, is always attributed to Le Corbusier, but it certainly is not his. It is a thing made by this international group, and he wrote it down and made a book out of it in 1933. And that all grew from this initiative. That's that internationalist sound. Now, what did they want in architecture? They were internationally oriented, as has been stressed before. They wanted more stress on rationalism, and particularly on an analysis of the brief. They wanted to go further in a direction that Berlage, in his exchange, already pointed out. And they wanted a stress on the use of the most advanced building techniques. They wanted skeletons, curtain walls, etc. And that kind of thing, as you can see, ties in with what had been written just slightly previously about the economy of design and style and about functionalism. And although the term was coined much later, it was originally called das neue new building, das neue Bauen, het nieuwe bouwen in Dutch, simply new building, modern architecture in a general sense. The term was attached much later on, and I'll show you now how this works out in two brief sketches of Dutch buildings, both of which will be probably unknown. This is a football stadium, an appealing subject, I think, today in these days of college football. This is, of course, for soccer, but the stadium would have to be quite the same. A large football stadium, fairly large, for 60,000 people. The brief said that as many people as possible should sit quite close to the field. That's, of course, obvious why. You can see far more detail. Which made it possible for the architects to consider getting the stands in two tiers. So you get more people, as in the theater, you get more people closer in. Secondly, they didn't want any vertical columns or stanchions which would support this upper tier for the reason that then you would miss some kind of goal, or what you would say here, touchdown. You would miss just a little detail of the match, and that would, of course, be horrible to miss. And as a result, they arrived at the most important design in the building was the section. This is the lower floor, and this is the upper tier of the stand. This is a covering which goes only over the, what you call it, the honors seats, or the grandstand, or where the officials sit. That's only part of the way, but the normal section is without this roof, as you can see over this side. And the architect considered various sections, moving this thing further down in this direction, and then they discovered that if you wanted to have a good view, which is quite obvious, if you want to have a good view, then you had to make this upper tier steeper and steeper as you got closer to the side. That made them decide to put the upper tier way back from the first, so that you could lower the incline. And that led to this sort of doubles, these two tiers over each other, the one slanted backwards over the first. That led also to the whole construction. As you can see, the stadium is constructed in steel. The architects made a study of what would be most economical, and they decided at that time building steel was extremely cheap, because this building was constructed in 1934, and we were in the midst of the Depression, and the steel was at really at bargain prices, and it turned out that they better constructed it in steel. Today, concrete would have been probably more less expensive than steel again. And that led to this kind of cross section, and that's actually the whole design of the building. Not entirely, because there are two more details of that. Here you have the stadium from the air, there you have the grandstand with the roof covering over it, and you can see the second problem in a stadium is to get all the people in and out in a very short period of time. They made trial runs in movie theaters, how many people could move through a small opening in a very short period. And so for that reason, and also for showing, because functionalism is very much about showing what the building is about. What are the working parts? What are the things that make it go around? They put the staircases not inside the steel structure, as they could have, but they put them on the outside. That turned out to be a boon for the construction, because the staircases were actually all prefabricated, made by a completely different contractor, and added on, stuck on, tagged on to the main shape of the building after the whole thing had been constructed. Here you see the building under construction, and you can see, well, for Americans it's a very normal kind of view, but it is a building completely prefabricated in parts. You get these trusses, which are raised one after the other, and you can simply add on to it. Yes, here is still a view of the grandstand and of one of these tiers, and you can see that you have this free view of the field entirely. Another building of similar form, that is, yes, oh no, those are those staircases, and you see that it looks this kind of, that is very economical, that is very thin and spidery kind of building. Here is another building. I'll go over that briefly too. That's a building which had no models at the time, although it has had models since. It's a wireless studio, the Avro studio in Hilversum, also constructed in the 30s, but based on the principles of the 20s. And it consisted of a series of studio rooms, as you can see, all pie-shaped, stuck onto each other. You can see the whole building has this peculiar circular form. That's all determined by, as a radio studio well might, by the most viable, most useful acoustical form. Now they wanted to have the best kind of music to transmit, and as a result of that, they saw, after getting acoustic advice, that a room like this one with parallel walls gives you fairly poor acoustics. You get flutter with echo. So what you want to do is to have non-parallel walls. And for that reason, they made rooms of these pie shapes. And no room is actually rectangular. They're all trapezoid in plan. And also have, of course, warped ceilings so that you get no reflections from that. And adding a series of these pie shapes together gives you this kind of peculiar sort of building. And gives this string all around. Now, a second point is that the announcer can nowadays be attached by closed-circuit television to all kinds of studios, but he couldn't in those days. Television was still in its infancy. It was just discovered and was certainly not a commercial process, so he had to do everything by view. So you see a small round thing at the intersection of this line and that line, in the middle, and that's where the announcer sits, and he can see everybody around him going into these doors, into these studios which are arranged in a circle around him, so that he would have excellent visibility. A third point is that if you want to have good studios, you need them to be acoustically soundproof also against the transmission of contact sound. So they have to be on a separate foundation. They built a trial cabin for finding out how far foundations have to be apart, not to transmit the noise of traffic and trucks and that kind of thing. And thereafter they constructed these buildings completely separately inside the shell. Of course, this is a fairly obvious thing which has been done very many times since, but there was no example for it at the day that it was constructed. For that reason also they didn't use the popular materials with functionalist architects, being concrete and steel and everything else of that kind. They use simply brick. Why? If you build a cavity wall out of concrete, you cannot inspect the inside of the concrete wall. There may be a lot of holes in it, air, spaces, bubbles, etc., and which will transmit sound. Whereas if you build them from cinder block, as they're built here, you can inspect them all around, and you can be absolutely sure that the mass of the wall is similar from one end to the other. Now I'll skip. Now we get another. We get into other kinds of problems. And this is a slide showing the interior of the dining room. No, the lunchroom, the canteen of this studio building, and there it shows its functionalist background quite clearly. And here, yes, I must change. There's a slide missing somewhere. No? I had a slide with, yes, that's it. this slide. This slide is obviously not from Holland, or perhaps not obviously, but it isn't Holland. This is Nazi Germany. And this is to remind you that in the later part of the in-between war years, the world had changed quite a bit. Hitler had taken over. All these well-known people, Gropius, Mies, had emigrated to the United States. The Bauhaus closed, everything else. You saw the tail end of it. We saw it from much closer by because we lived in we were their next door neighbors. This Nazism led to this historicist, classicist kind of architecture, and it led to this historicist kind of architecture also in Holland. And I want to show you that this is a member of the Dutch CM group, Van Ravenstein, the architect of the railways, and he did, this is a railway, what do you call it, signal house, a railway signal house, he did in the 20s. But in the 30s, he's had a change of heart. He started to doubt the principles of functionalism. And so he did this building. And it's hardly believable that it's the same architect. But he sincerely was convinced that this kind of thing was actually too dry, too newfangled, and not at all the kind of line that architects should take. It should appeal to emotions. It should have something in line with tradition. And as a result of that, he designed this, which you can see has, although it's not a real classical or classicist building, it has quite a bit of classical influence. And here we have on the left-hand side, we have a building by Oud. This is the building for which Oud, the famous architect of that Unicafé, that little, of lots of housing projects, and a famous architect in the modern movement, and he made this building, and he was criticized a great deal by his friends and colleagues also in the 30s. Well, it was actually constructed during the war, but he designed it during the 30s because this building contained all kinds of decoration. Look, for instance, at this entrance part, how there's quite clearly some decoration on that, which shows that he also had deviated from the correct functionalist stance. After the war, functionalism was the style of the day. They won what they had never thought before, was imitated the world over thereafter, and what was not imitated was this quite careful analysis of the brief and this kind of meticulous way of going about it and trying to construct something that would really work. But on the contrary, it's just a normal sort of thing in the trade-offs of architectural forms. They simply used the outer trappings. Well, the architecture became modern by using simply acres of plate glass and curtain walls and everything else. Now, this is the architecture that's familiar from downtown all over the world in the 50s and 60s. It could be America, but it happens to be Rotterdam. Now, the architects who still felt that it was architecture is something different, that it shouldn't do this kind of thing, changed their minds and became quite antagonistic to this cool and clear and matter-of-fact and cheap kind of approach. And those are the architects we know best because they're the architects of our own day. I'll show you the change in a building which is in a sense transitional, which is the auditorium in my own school, in my School of Architecture in Delft. There you see it standing at the end of this street, at the intersection of this, well, here it is, that building. These are the school buildings all around it in a fairly nondescript style, and here is the city of Delft, and this building stands right at the entrance of this sort of avenue between those large school buildings. It's not a campus, but they're all constructed on both sides of the road. The architect Van der Broek and Bakema, who constructed this, well, Van der Broek certainly was himself, had belonged in the 30s still to the Dutch Siam group, and as a result he had quite a few functionalist ideas still. But you'll see how they change over time and how he is different from what it is today, from what it was in the early days in the 30s. The program of the building called for a large auditorium, but also for 4 classrooms for this building over here. This building was short of classrooms, and there were actually 4 lecture theaters, and these 4 lecture theaters had to be accommodated in the same building as this large auditorium. That turned out to be a boon because this large auditorium is, as most large auditoriums, not very much used, and these 4 classrooms are used all day long. As a result, this building is always full of students, whereas otherwise it would be completely empty for most of the time and only filled in a few days. This is the lower floor. As you can see, there's very little building on this side. Then it gets into really a building only on the first floor. Here you see this large auditorium, and here you see those 4 classrooms. You can see that these 4 classrooms are fan-shaped, and that's for acoustical reasons, for the same reasons which made these fan-shaped fan-shaped studio rooms of the radio building. Over here is well, it's not shown on either of these plans, but there's a bridge connecting this part of the building to a floor on that part, so that you can push in little carts. This is a physical engineering building, so you can push in trays with little experiments arranged on it, so the professor can show them in his classroom and cart them back into the building afterwards. That was one of the program requirements. In between those 4 classrooms and this large auditorium is this is a series of tables arranged here in a mechanical way, but they're better arranged now. This is a canteen which serves both this area, and if this large auditorium is used, serves also that area. Now that's all straightforward. The most interesting part is the circulation, and just as in this Feyenoord stadium, the football stadium I showed you, the circulation is all on the outside, and quite purposefully. They wanted this, well, for one thing, they wanted these classrooms to be completely in the dark, so as this one is, so you could slow slide and you could be completely isolated. For another thing, they needed fire staircases. And the architects arranged all circulation patterns here on the outside and here also on outside rims, so the envelope of the building contains hardly any rooms. It contains mainly staircases and corridors. And he arranged the central staircases going up from this part here. You enter here, then you go up these interior staircases, and you can reach either the auditorium on that side, or you can reach these parts, and then you can continue into the upper tiers through stairs over there. This kind of arrangement made it possible to put the fire staircases outside as required by the fire for a large public building. These outside fire staircases, to put them also on the exterior but in line with the interior staircases. So what is usually a sort of stuck-on device has been in this building turned into something really quite dynamic, and you can see the similarity to the stadium building. Now this interest in showing how the transportation system in this building works. Now why did he raise this building on stilts and put it upward? That has also to do with the sort of attitude of the architect, which is influenced by functionist ideas, which is that the architect said, I want to show that it's an auditorium building. Now, if it were a Greek theater, I could see that from the outside. I just walk over the edge of a Greek theater and see everybody sitting in that theater. But that's not possible in Dutch climate. You can't make a Greek theater because it rains about 60-70% of the year, and so you can use it only in the summer months, and then there are no students. So you have to make a covered auditorium. How can you show how people are seated in an auditorium without putting them in the rain? Well, you can show the underside of the auditorium, and that's what he did. Look, there you see this large auditorium building, and there you see the outside. Here are the tiers of seats all converging on the stage. And there you see the building, a model of the building, and you see that it has a folded roof. Because, also quite important, is the construction, and you can well imagine that this construction caused a lot of headaches. This is all pre-stressed concrete, but this roof is not resting on this substructure. If it had to rest on a central pillar, which would obstruct view, which would be acceptable to the client. So this is all cantilevered from this point outward. This is in fact a very large pillar. It was marked in the plan too. They are connected by a huge beam over there, and over this beam, you can see it running over here, are cantilevered out these huge folded roofs. And you can see that their shape changes so that it changes along with the area moment. As the moment gets smaller, the shape gets thinner too. So it's really a sort of demonstration piece for large concrete constructions. Now, what are those things are quite familiar and can be attached to the functionalist attitude in building. What are those things which make it distinct from functionalist building? Those are, I think, the plasticity of the building, making it so far more a loud and noisy and strong building, in the same sense that this building and the library across the street is a strong building, very heavy plastic shapes which hit you in the face, and which are, of course, derived in part or influenced by Le Corbusier's later work, the Jaoul houses and the Ronchamp chapel. And the Smithsons got into this same kind of hard edge, rough kind of architecture too, and that influence is definitely post-war, and that's also very definitely the influence of Bakama, who is the younger partner, and who was very much involved in that kind of thing. I can show you still here the interior staircases. Oh, that's upside down, I'm sorry, that's a mistake. And here you see this cantilevering tier of the theater. It caused the engineer already quite a bit of headaches to construct this large pillar. Van den Broek wanted to have it as thin as a rail, of course, which is absolutely impossible to take the weight. And here you see this huge cantilevered roof, which is continued all over the rear side to get a unified shape for the whole thing. There you see the roof cantilever. You see a cross-section through this cantilevered roof on that side. Now, I get into other. There was another stance. People felt that architecture had become too general. Buildings became larger and larger. We got the first turnkey projects, also in Holland. The combinations and trusts and huge industries became the thing of the day, and as a result buildings got larger and more impersonal, clients got larger and more impersonal, architecture got larger and more impersonal and of huge scale. And so some way of counteracting that is the stance taken by Van Eyck and Herzberger, is trying to revert to small scale things, to try to take buildings to pieces and to make them into things which are still of our own size and which we feel at home. This is the well-known Foundling Hospital. Look how he is already quite far off from functionalism. Of course, he's again a bit, he's, well, not much younger, but he was never involved in it before the war. Here is, this building is a Foundling Hospital, and the Foundlings, actually a fairly large crowd originally, were subdivided in families, in groups, and these groups are all given, these families are all given their own home, and that's the cause. Now, do I get any light of it anymore? I don't think. Well, here still. These groups are seen here. 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side, and on that side you get also 1, 2, 3, 4. Not all 8 in a row, but 4 on one row and 4 on another row, so that it even doesn't look rows. It's simply as much distributed, so that you don't get a really repetitive pattern. The interior court, although all these families are alike, the interior courtyards are all different, so as to give at least a little bit of personal flavor to every single one of these buildings. These little buildings consist of day rooms on the ground floor and dormitories above. These dormitories are, I hope you can still see it on these squares on this side. And Van Eyck made a really very elaborate affair of the entrance. He felt that buildings should not be entered just like that by going through a door, but you should have a sort of working up kind of affair, as you do have, in fact, in this building, in a way. But he would feel that that would be probably too large, because he tried to scale it down, thinking of children. So he made first a sort of set-off here on the top part, and then you got in through an angle in an interior courtyard, and only through the interior courtyard could you get into the building. He also made the corridor along this building all as an interior street. I don't know whether there's a slide showing that his interior street lamps, but he used lamp posts, as are used also always on streets. And he made them of street materials, concrete, tiles and everything, and bricks. And here are a few views of this interiors on that street level. Now, this is not the interiors of little rooms, but these are interiors of that street. In that rooms he made special places. He is always fond of saying that a building is a bunch of places, of separate little nooks and crannies in which you are supposed to live, and it's not just one large go and a huge space or anything like that, because you don't feel at home at that. You will always want to have a little nook for yourself. So he created these nooks and crannies by making them in brick and making scaled down spaces in his already not very large spaces. These are his exterior lamps. See, these are lamps which are also used in outside lighting. That's where they stem from. Here are children playing in that area, and to create a sort of separate feeling for all these families and groups of people, he made a roof into a series of domes in the old belief, or the old, very traditional and old idea, that a little world of your own is covered by a sky of your own, so you get really a little sky in the form of a cupola. It's not a real cupola in the old sense with a huge bulbous dome, but a small dome, and it's lit by a top light. Or some of them are lit by top lights. That's the sort of building, that's the one and only really nice slide, which gives you somewhat of the feel, and you can see that it's indeed a very small-scale building, although its building volume is not small at all. This kind of idea that architecture should get more involved and it should get away from this cold and mathematical and dull world of boxes and plate glass was of course prevalent in American architecture too. And just to remind you that the same mood prevailed in this country, I show these two well-known buildings, the Trans World Airlines by Saarinen and the Art and Architecture building, which is actually very much a new brutalism idea of Rudolph. Now, just one last, that's the last set of slides that will be shown. I've really tested your endurance beyond the danger point. This is a building of which I have no finished slides, although the building is finished. This is by Hetzberger, a friend and younger colleague of Van Eyck, and who very much believes too that a building should be a lot of small spaces. This is a huge office building. As you can see from the slide over here, and from sizing it up from here, this is one of those cubicles constructed over there. And in that, he didn't want to have a huge office floor with a landscape of little desks and partitions and screens, etc., and everybody feeling lost in this sea of typewriters. He wanted to have them all individual units, and so he constructed all individual units. And that, I think, although history never closes, and this lecture doesn't have a good final remark, but that's all I have to say and show. That's it. Oh no.